think you have to stick to the fact that it's not up to us as leaders to come up with the solutions to everything. And usually, more often than not, the solution will come from the group of people or the person even that you're speaking to. It's a balance, isn't it, between leading a conversation and really being open to finding out where that conversation is going to go and being receptive to ideas.
Hi there, I'm Ben Morton and welcome to another episode of the podcast. It's the weekly show that brings you inspiring interviews with senior leaders and genuine subject matter experts from all around the globe. And it's all designed to help you be the very best leader you can possibly be. It's my gift to you and it's completely free. In today's episode of the Ben Morton Leadership Podcast, I'm talking with Alex Brooks-Johnson, who is the CEO of Gleaned, a leading social care charity on the south coast of Britain. With 25 years' experience in the charity sector, Alex is passionate about addressing social inequality and using his skills and experience to create and grow social value in the community and drive societal change. In this episode of the show, we go deep on just a few key topics. And in listening, you can expect to learn a number of very practical tips for having difficult conversations that we all need to have as leaders from time to time, but tips to help you do so in a way that achieves the outcome you need to achieve without leaving those involved, including ourselves, feeling unnecessarily bruised. You'll learn how to effect cultural change in organisations where the existing culture is deeply, deeply ingrained. We look at how to stay resilient and motivated ourselves when trying to change culture and do things differently. And you'll also learn how Alex is really mixing up and changing the normal approach to performance management to great effect within Gleaned and how you can do the same. That's enough of an introduction though, so let's dive right in. Here's my interview with Alex Brooks-Johnson. Alex, can you tell us please about your first memorable leadership experience? And that could be good or bad, and experience in the workplace and how that has gone on to influence how you operate as a leader yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had quite a fairly traumatic experience as a junior leader. Several things have happened to me as a manager before that, but this was the first time it really felt like a significant leadership moment. So I worked for my first charity, was an international development organisation called Children's Aid Direct, and it got into financial difficulty and ended up going into liquidation about 20 years ago. Quite a big agency. I worked in 14, 15 countries, sort of 20 million turnover, more than 100 staff. It was quite a big operation. And it was quite big news in the sector. PwC were acting as the administrator, and I learned a lot from them, actually, about negotiation. It's the first time I'd had a glimpse into that world, and that sort of just blew me away a little bit. The experience which I think has shaped me it was quite a traumatic time for the whole organisation, really. And as such, a lot of the senior people were impacted by stress. And so it ended up with me being in the fundraising department and communications department, which is, about 40 people, I think, roughly, maybe 30, 40 people. I ended up being the most senior person there, and therefore having to have redundancy conversations with people that I've been working very closely with for years. It was very hard to do, but actually I did it, and it's really helped me realise the importance of not shying away from these things and just being brave, facing these things head on, and just trying not to be somebody else. So it really taught me early on the values of being an authentic leader. It's kind of shaped me, and I always go back to that. Even, I had an experience this week where we've had to break some bad news to some tenants in one of our sheltered housing schemes. And even then, before that meeting, this was 20 odd years ago, I thought about, that leadership experience of being exposed, of thinking, why me? Why am I the one that's standing here in front of these people or having to have these meetings with people? It's an experience that shaped me.
Yeah, I'd love to dig a little deeper into that actually, Alex, because the topic of handling difficult conversations, challenging conversations, uncomfortable conversations, whatever you want to call them, is so often the thing that people say they want from any leadership and management training. Just I think a lot of people are nervous, fearful of them. Maybe that's because they worry about saying the wrong thing and kind of the legal ramifications. Then there's the more human side, so not wanting to hurt people. So if you go back to that experience for you, were you in any sort of formal leadership or management position at that time? I know you said you ended up being the most senior, but what was your leadership management experience up until that point?
It had all been about management. So I was a team manager, and the team was probably about 10 people ish. I was a junior manager. Really, that was my first glimpse into leadership, the difference between management and leadership. But I think you're absolutely right. The skill in having a difficult conversation is one that is really important to develop, because you can't get through life as a leader without having difficult conversations. No matter how well things are going, it will always crop up. So it's an absolute fundamental part of any leader's repertoire.
Yeah.
Has to be.
And did anybody give you any sort of guidance or counsel in that experience before you had to go and have those?
No,
Right.
none at all. I mean, there was nobody around to do it, really.
Right.
It was, I'm painting a really stark picture, and I could get that, but it was, it was a tough time. That was why it was such a monumental experience for me, is because it was, I felt really quite exposed and actually came through it with some really good feedback. But partly because it was, it's really my friends that, having these really difficult conversations with.
Well, that makes it even harder.
We really did, yeah, and had some really good feedback about how it was delivered. And I think really made me think about the importance of being that genuine character, that's open and honest. And that has really shaped my leadership style for the next 20 odd years.
Yeah.
But yeah, based on just not shying away from, because the longer you leave it, the harder that conversation gets.
Yeah. So if I take you back to a sort of 24 hours, 48 hours before sort of one of those first conversations, what were you doing to prepare and plan for them?
Yeah, so I made sure that I was as up to speed as I could be about the legal side of things, and making sure that I got the process right,
Yeah.
thinking about what questions I was going to get asked. I do remember preparing very thoroughly. I mean, and everyone knew it was coming, so it wasn't a massive surprise to people. And actually, later on in my career, including here at Guildcare, we've been through some quite significant restructures, and, I've had to have conversations with people where it has been a bit of a surprise to them or a complete surprise to them. And I think that is a lot harder. But I think, yes, being prepared, absolutely key, especially when it comes to that sort of more technical HR, employment law side of managing people.
But I think that piece you said there, where I almost spoke over you, Alex, around trying to think about what questions they might have to ask you, be that on the technical side or perhaps more personal and emotional. I think that's so important, right? And I think sometimes in focusing and worrying on about the technical aspects, we can sometimes forget that it's a human we're going to be sitting opposite, right? Who's got family to feed, maybe bills to pay, kind of worries about if they're going to be okay.
It's always a good reminder, isn't it, when you do get those questions that you haven't actually thought about, and it's a really good reminder. We've just done some reorganisation here, and we were talking to one of the teams that's involved in the reorganisation, and we were talking about how much we're investing in these services over the next, it's millions of pounds of investment that are going into these services over the next few years. How excited we are that they're part of our strategic development, and how we could see this team really helping us to reduce social isolation in the community that we work, and we were getting really excited about it. And we kind of finished with, and this is where you're going to be based. We're going to invest and make this office, beautiful place to work in a really inspiring environment. And we finished, expecting a round of applause. And we got, well, where are we going to park? As much as you get excited about these things, it's always, sometimes down to the very basic personal, how's it going to impact me stuff. That's always good to try and remember, because these things are important.
Yeah, I don't know if this will resonate or if you've got any thoughts on this. And this isn't so much a question, I don't think, but listening to you talking about your experiences there of handling challenging conversations, it reminded me of one of my earliest jobs out of the army. I was working towards the end of that job as the head of HR in a expedition company, which you know of actually, working at World Challenge, and we was going to have to make some restructures to the department that was planning all of the expeditions, and there was a risk for doing it that there might be some possible redundancies. But from a really good intent, we was trying to do it really collaboratively and say, look, we've got to make this change. We don't know what it's going to look like yet. We want your input. I kind of went about it that way. I said, look, we don't know all the answers. This is what I do know, thinking that would be a good approach. And it absolutely bombed, just because straight away people had loads of questions. I'm like, oh, God, I've really tried to do the good thing. But even then, I still didn't quite think actually and put myself really in their shoes and think, well, how are they going to feel? What are they going to want to know? So, yeah, I just think it's interesting. We can have really good intentions, but we can still get it wrong, can't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to stick to the fact that it's not up to us as leaders to come up with the solutions to everything. And usually, more often than not, the solution will come from the group of people or the person even that you're speaking to. It's a balance, isn't it, between leading a conversation and really being open to finding out where that conversation is going to go and being receptive to ideas. But I think that's one of the balances that is, it's really hard to strike sometimes. Some situations require more collaborative approach than others. Sometimes you need to be a bit more straightforward with people and a bit more direct.
Yeah, and that's interesting as well, Alex, because again, I don't know if you've experienced this yourself or sort of know of colleagues who have experienced this. Over the past few years, when I was doing a lot of work with leadership teams, I'd often spend some time talking to sort of the senior people who is reporting into the head of the MD or the CEO to sort of get some insights and feedback into what's going on with the team. There was a period where quite often I would hear things like, it's great that X is really collaborative and asks for our input. But you know what? Sometimes we just wish he'd say, this is what we're doing. We're going in this direction, and just make the decision. And I found that really interesting. And I wonder if it's because over the past, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, there's been so much written in sort of the leadership and management press about collaboration and sort of engagement, that if you imagine a spectrum, I guess, between highly collaborative and highly directive, we've just kind of found ourselves shifted and weighted a little bit towards one end and forgotten that actually sometimes a leader does need to say, we're going this way. This is why.
And sometimes people, absolutely, will respond to that. And I think that working in the voluntary sector, we do tend to be more on the collaborative end, I think, naturally.
Yeah.
And actually, when I came to Guildcare 4 years ago, I joined an organisation that had some cultural challenges. And I was like, okay, my approach was, let's get together and talk about it. Tell me what the problems were. But I was met with a deathly silence because we just hadn't had that culture here. And people were really worried about speaking up, really worried about repercussions, really worried about what their colleagues were going to think about them, talking to the management. Initially it was quite frustrating. It was like, well, why won't they talk to me? What are they scared of? And then I realized that actually you've got to create that culture. You've got to create that psychological safety. You have to work on that. And it's not about saying, oh, go on, you can trust me. Don't worry. There'll be no repercussions. It's not that simple. you have to build that. It's taken 4 years.
Yeah.
Still not there. I mean, I have an open door policy, but also anybody can get hold of me anytime in a confidential way. It's obviously really important in a social care organization, but also, that's the sort of leader I am. If somebody had said that to me as a junior employee 25 years ago, you can speak to the chief exec about anything, I'd probably be sending stuff every day. But I get very little. And every now and then I could sort of do a push for it and I'll get, a couple of ideas. But if it had been me, there'd be a flood of ideas and feedback, moaning about this, challenges about this. But we haven't quite got there with the culture yet. I think that's my ambition, is to get to a point where I'm really annoyed by the amount of feedback that I'm getting.
Yeah. Brilliant. That's a great sign of success, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that's what you've shared is fascinating and quite common. I was working with a client just the other day, and they're trying to, for what they need to deliver, they really need to create a culture that is much more innovative, where people are happy to suggest new things, knowing it might not work out, and challenge how all the rest of the organization thinks. And the head of this function is trying to land this message, and they feel they're being met with almost reasons why it can't work. And they was asking me for some tips and advice. And it's partly because the existing culture is one where people are all expected to have all of the answers, all of the detail at any minute. And I think there is, to a degree, a sort of fear might be slightly too strong, but along that lines of getting it wrong, getting caught out, making a mistake. So based on your experience that you've just shared, if there were 3 tips or suggestions you could share with listeners who are in a similar situation, where, as you said, really they're trying to create more psychological safety, kind of what would you suggest? I've heard you say already about sort of really pushing that open door policy, but what else have you been doing or trying, Alex?
So I've been trying to be really consistent with our leadership approach.
Okay.
So we're, not a huge organization, but we have probably about, well, in our SLT, there's 7 people. Across our kind of junior middle management team, there's probably about 30 people. And we've done a lot of work on leadership behaviors and trying to establish a level of consistency so that the wider employee team know that they're going to get a consistent approach when either they have a problem or if they've got an idea. We're asking people to get engaged in the organization. When they do get engaged, then it will be great if there was a consistent response to that, so that it wasn't reliant on the odd kind of personal relationship around the organization.
Yeah.
So that consistency in leadership, I would say, is really key, and that relies on outlining expectations of leaders' values and behaviours, but then regular checking and monitoring that those values and leadership behaviours are being adhered to, really. And we do that through our performance management framework.
Right.
So values are up there with performance. We have objectives on values, and the leaders, in fact, the whole organisation, have a conversation about values every month as part of their performance management framework.
So your performance management framework is monthly?
Yeah. So I was really insistent on that. There's a lot of pushback. And actually, we spent about 6 months designing this program.
Yeah.
The day that we launched it, I moved house.
Right.
It was the only day out of the 3 years I'd been here then, or 2.5 years, the only day that I couldn't be here. And we launched it, and I got a phone call at the halfway through the day saying there's a mutiny. And,
what was your response? If I leave home, there's going to be a mutiny at home as well. So which one should I deal with?
Exactly, yeah. So I said, look, this is a red line. So I very, very rarely say this, but that we have to push this through, because I was convinced that it's what the organisation needed to establish better relationships, to break down these silos. It was a communication block both ways, upwards and downwards. The general kind of values, was inconsistent. So I was absolutely insistent that we stuck to a month, but I sort of gave a little bit back by saying there's some flexibility in the amount of time, and also we can tweak the form and this, that, and the other. But stuck to my guns, and I'm so glad I did, because it's now embedded practice. Get very high percentages of these monthly meetings happening, and people can really see the benefit in having a monthly conversation with your manager that is, protected time, not disturbed. I mean, we've tweaked it. Actually, we've developed it in the operational services, where it's now a lot more about observation than a sit-down conversation, and that's been a really good development, actually. But it still happens monthly.
Yeah. So where did the initial potential mutiny come from? Was it from the sort of leaders of managers who were going to be sort of running the conversations?
So their reaction was, I'm not going to have time to do this. Where are we going to do it? So, kind of physical space, where are we going to do it? Practicalities. And what's the point? All good questions, which, took a little while for people to get their heads around, I think. And I think it's like a lot of things, it seemed to. So we spent 2 days launching it. It was like wrapped up in a management conference. And maybe we made too much of a big thing of it. And actually, maybe a lighter touch, softer launch might have been a better way of doing it, just so it wasn't this kind of big change in people's lives. But also, it's sometimes these things can look over bureaucratic, and they can look really cumbersome and time consuming, when actually, once you get into the rhythm of it, you can get those conversations down to 20, 30 minutes. Once you've got set objectives and you've been through that process of talking, explaining what a KPI is, but then also, how to set them and how to manage them. Once you've done that sort of upfront piece of work, that investment in time, then you're flying. And luckily, that's where we are now.
It's the same with anything, probably. It depends on people's sort of reference point, doesn't it? So if the managers who you're asking to do this new process, if their reference point, if they're just thinking about the current system and how much work it is to do it twice a year, or if their reference point is maybe them themselves being on the receiving end of some really uncomfortable kind of performance management processes in previous organizations, then that's what I guess what they think they're going to be having to do every 4 weeks, in which case it would feel overwhelming, I suspect.
Yeah, it would do. Or if you're used to just having an annual appraisal.
Yeah, which most of us are.
And we've scrapped that kind of annual conversation, and that's what's spread out over monthly. So when people start to realise that, then I think it starts to make a bit more sense.
Yeah. And how long did it take before you started to get majority buy-in and acceptance?
A couple of years.
Oh, really? I thought you were going to say 6 months.
Yeah,
Wow.
Yes. No, I'd say a good couple of years. And I would say we've only just really started to tip the balance.
Wow.
And I would say we've only just started to tip the balance culturally as well. So generally, it's kind of, it was what tipped us over the edge of being pre-culture change to post-culture change conversation, was the acceptance of that performance management framework, which we've just adapted, actually. So we've just changed it again to be a bit more specific to job roles. So there's a performance management framework for managers. There's one for heads of services, and there's one for directors.
What are the tangible benefits that the new sort of appraisal structure is bringing to the organisation?
Performance, broadly speaking, but also values too. So everyone in the organisation, and we test this through a regular survey. So every year we ask the same 5 questions.
Oh, I like that as well. The fact it's just 5 questions.
Yeah, just 5. And we're seeing an improvement in each of those areas every year. The majority of that is down to having a structured approach to performance management. But actually, the performance of the organisation, we're projecting in 2 years to have doubled our turnover in 6 years, and that's through a pandemic. We're also projecting quite an increase in social impact as well. So it's not just about the turnover of the organisation, but
that turnover for your sector is really significant, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, So generally speaking, I would say it's the improvement in performance and the fact that we are holding people to account, which wasn't being done before, and holding people to account in both performance in their jobs, but also their behaviours, because collectively we've agreed these values, and collectively we've agreed the leadership behaviours. So actually, if you start to behave outside of that agreed construct, then there'll be consequences. That's now an agreed, established way of working.
This is a really fascinating conversation, Alex. It's not where I necessarily thought our chat would go today, but I'm really intrigued to keep it exploring this. So, as I said, I was expecting you to say it had taken sort of 6 months maybe to drive through the change. So, if it's the case that it's kind of 2 years and still ongoing, I'm really curious. Like, how does your personal resilience stand up to that, and what do you do yourself? So you've got the energy, the drive to keep going and pushing it through. Like, how do you do that, and where does that come from?
So every now and then, when it's all getting a bit much, I go out on a minibus to pick up some of the older people in the community and take them to their social isolation session, which we don't call it that, by the way. It's, whatever activity it is. And it just really hits home why I'm here. So I don't know why, and most of my friends don't work in the voluntary sector. And I'm always talking to them about how on earth do you keep going, and you're really working yourself into an early grave to make somebody else wealthy. I don't get that. But so I've got this social purpose. The organization has a social purpose, which I will always come back to when things get really tough. But I can see that there's progress. So I think if you have the right measurement tools or the right framework in place, and you can see that there's progress, I think no matter how slow that progress is, it's still encouraging. Yeah, I mean, it's been tested quite a bit. And the thing about social care, and this is my first social care job, is it's very unpredictable and very operational. And so I can get distracted for days on operational issues, which will take me away from that strategic leadership role. But we've got some really good ways of measuring our progress in place. So as long as I can see things are moving in the right direction, even if it's kind of nudging along, then that's enough for me.
Mm. And do you ever find there is a tension anywhere in the organisation based on the fact that you're in the third sector with a real sense of purpose? You yourself as an individual, the organisation. I would assume many of the people who work in the organisation are there as well because, to a degree, they connect with that social purpose. But does that at all create a tension between that and trying to create a high performance organization with strong standards where people are held to account?
I'd say no, and I think that's one of the misconceptions about charities is that they are not commercially astute organisations that hold people to account and have talk about performance, because that's what a good charity should be doing, in my mind. And there are some organisations in the voluntary sector that probably don't do us any favours. In the same way, there are some companies that are amazingly ethical. And one of the things that I've been doing here is trying to create more of a charity. So when I joined the organisation, I think it was really focused on its commercial activities and running them really well. But the charitable side of things wasn't really that developed, even though we've been around for 90 years as a community-based organisation and was set up by volunteers. Got an amazing history, actually.
I guess that puts your cultural change program into some context as well.
It really does. Yeah, what's 2 years in 90 years? It's
Yeah.
a drop in the ocean.
Equally, trying to change 90 years of inbuilt culture and behaviors is like it's the metaphor of turning an oil tanker, right?
Absolutely. It was a bit like that, turning an oil tanker or waking a sleeping giant as one of the people that I met when I first got here. It was the chief exec, actually, of the local council. And he said, "Oh, you've come to wake the sleeping giant that is Guildcare, have you?" And I thought, well, that's interesting. But actually, what we're trying to do is get back to the original ethos, where how the organisation was created 90 years ago. Bearing in mind it was ahead of the NHS and the welfare state. And it was a local group of people that got together and thought, actually, we need some support here. And were motivated, passionate, and skilled enough to create, this organisation that we've got today, which is a phenomenal achievement. So we're trying to get back to our roots, actually, in many ways, of being that community-based charity, and we always have been. It's just, I think the focus was slightly different. 25 years in the charity sector tends to shape your style a bit, and that's what we're trying to create. But it's really about being a professional organisation that's commercially run, that has the right people in the right place, exactly the same way a company would go about trying to grow and develop.
Mm. You mentioned shaping your style there, which is a lovely unplanned segue, sort of on a slightly different tack, but it is a nice segue. I'm just curious, probably maybe the penultimate question, but I'm curious to ask about how you sort of your early career working as an outdoor activity instructor. How did that shape you as a leader, and what influence did that have on you?
It's fundamentally shaped me, and you'll know this better than me, but there's a reason why the military use the outdoors to shape their leaders, because I think there's so much you can learn from it. It's directly tangible. A day out in the mountains, it will give you so many, if you're that way inclined, will give you so many analogies about life and work and, your career and your leadership style. It's not true, really. I mean, it's incredible. And I don't do so much of it now, as you might be able to tell, but it's being out in the wilderness. It teaches you lots of things. So humility, firstly, the fact that actually you're insignificant no matter what you do. You're not dispensable, you're not significant, and there are only so many things that you can control, and most of the things you can't control. So actually, there's a real kind of almost a spiritual experience of being in the outdoors, which I think is really important philosophically as a leader of an organization, to realize that, no matter how hard you try, no matter how good you are, no matter how many hours you put in, there are things outside of your control that are going to happen, whether you like it or not, and you've just got to deal with it. And I think the outdoors fundamentally teaches you those things. And then there's, all sorts of specifics about the tenacity, your resilience, the fact that you have to be adaptive. Nothing ever goes to plan. But also when you're actually leading a group, sometimes you've got to be out the front there leading. Sometimes you drop back a bit. If you've got a group of highly skilled climbers, then you don't need to be hovering over their shoulder and retying their knots for them. But if you've got a group that are brand new to climbing, that's exactly what you need to do. And you need to be leading for them. And I think in business or in organizations, it's exactly the same thing. If things are going really well and you've got a really high performing team around you, I'm not saying you sit back, but it's a very different approach to if you've got new people that are underperforming, or there's things going on in the environment that are causing you a challenge. And that's where you need to be kind of front and center, and the outdoors teaches you that like nothing else can, including experiences in leadership roles. I think everybody should have to do a mountain leader course.
Yeah, it's been wonderful listening to you share all of that just now, Alex, because it's really given me the reminder of, as you say, just how powerful the outdoors is, really teaching us about situational leadership and like all the situations, like understanding the skills and experience of the people in your team, and almost the fears and motivations. For some people, walking along quite a broad ridge line might be terrifying for some people. For others, they might be skipping along it. The situation depending on the weather, the conditions, changing your plans. It is probably the best teacher, certainly of situational leadership, if not leadership much more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I think about my job on a day-to-day basis, probably the biggest skill that I use, the most frequently used skill is risk assessment. That's what I do every morning. I come in and I do a risk assessment, on what, the most likely, the likelihood of things going wrong, and what's the impact of that, and how can I mitigate that? Every morning I do a risk assessment, and nothing teaches you better than outdoors and adventure about assessing risk, which you do on a dynamic basis, and that's really all I do here.
Yeah, brilliant. Alex, I could honestly keep on chatting to you all afternoon. It's been such a rich conversation. I've got a new tradition of asking the same closing question to every guest, which is a bit of a twist on a question probably we all ask ourselves from time to time. But it's, what would you say is the best mistake that you've ever made?
Best mistake. It's a tricky one because I've made lots of mistakes, but most of them, if not all of the ones other than this one thing I can think of, have ended in disaster. But having spent some time in fundraising and marketing, usually it's a financial disaster. I've been lucky enough to have, in my time as a chief executive, which is probably about, I think, 12 years, 11 years, something like that. There's only ever been one person that has left me that I didn't want to leave. Now, some people might listen to this and think, oh, cheers. But, there's genuinely only one person that I lost that I really regretted. And that was somebody here at Guildcare. And the reason it was a mistake was because I think the reason that she left was something I could have done something about, and actually ended up doing something about, but too late. And so that was a big mistake. And the reason it was such a big mistake is because this person really embodied those values that I was talking about, and those, just naturally caring, compassionate, amazing person. And it was a huge loss to, what I was trying to achieve, and a huge loss to the organization. And then I stayed in touch with her. And then once I kind of addressed the issues, I got in touch with her and asked her if she would rejoin the organisation as a trustee, and she has. So that's the mistake that's kind of turned out to be good. And now she's, an amazing trustee, and we're really lucky to have her on board, and highly skilled nurse, actually. So yeah, that was my biggest mistake that actually turned out okay.
Brilliant. Love that. Alex, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really wonderful chatting to you. There's so many little insights and tips that I know listeners will be able to take away and use. And as I say, I've thoroughly enjoyed spending time with you today as well myself. So thank you so much for sharing your experience, your expertise, knowledge and wisdom. Really appreciate it. Before you go, just let me say thank you for joining Alex and myself for this episode of the Ben Morton Leadership Podcast. If this conversation has been useful for you, if the topics we've discussed have resonated, and if you've learned something useful to help you on your leadership and management journey, then please share it with your friends and colleagues so that they can learn the same tips and have the same experience. And before you go, do check out the Leaders Kit Bag episodes of the show. It's the weekly micro edition of the podcast. Each and every episode is just 5 or 6 minutes long, and it focuses on one very practical leadership tip or tactic. So far in the series, we've covered planning and prioritization, motivation, and very soon, if you're listening live, we've got resilience coming up as the next topic. And again, once you've listened, do share them with your colleagues and share links to them on social media so that together we can improve the leadership capability in our companies, charities, and institutions. After all, the world needs great leaders now more than ever. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for supporting the show. Thanks for being committed to being the best leader you can possibly be. And until next time, lead on.